Hello, welcome to the next video in the CSC280 Introduction to Cybersecurity series. Today the focus is still on authentication, but we'll talk a little bit more about single sign-on infrastructures. In the previous videos we said that authentication is all about identification plus verification. So that we basically combine an assertion or a claim of identity with evidence of that claim. And if the evidence is sufficiently compelling, we're going to believe the claim. So the problem at the moment is that we use so many different systems each day as we go through our daily lives. We use our social media platforms, we sign into school, to the LMS, as in our case that's Moodle, we check our grades or our registrations, we go for email, we send messages across different platforms. Each time we do something like that, we're interacting with a different computer system. And in principle, each of those computer systems needs to know who we are. And that would mean that we have to authenticate individually to each of those systems each time that we use them. And that is, in fact, what is happening. Every system that we interact with knows who we are. Yet, we don't want to have to, worst case scenario, enter usernames and passwords each time that we interact with a computer system. On a typical day we might interact with 50 or 60 different systems, and most of us have access to hundreds and hundreds of services and systems. And so having to do that each system and each time that we use the system is wildly inconvenient and will lead to lots of frustration. And as we've seen in the past, as soon as users start being frustrated with security controls, they will find ways to bypass them, and the consequence is that our controls at that point become ineffective, and we might actually end up with a situation that is worse than the one that we started with. So to that effect, we build single sign-on systems. A single sign-on system is an authentication system or an authentication service to which we identify ourselves and provide evidence of our identity. And then the systems that we use go to that sign-on system and say, hey, did this person authenticate themselves? And if so, who are they? And the benefit of that is that I don't have to authenticate to each system individually. I authenticate to the single sign-on system, and then all my systems that I want to use check with that single sign-on system to make sure that the credential that I provided matched the claim of identity that I made. Now, of course, a single sign-on system has benefits. The primary benefit is that users like them. They only have to sign in once, and then everything works and everything knows who they are. They also have to only maintain one credential. And that one credential, of course, makes them more likely to actually use it, choose a strong one, and maybe not share it with others. So from that perspective, a single sign-on system will actually improve security. However, the big disadvantage is that single sign-on means that if your username and password, or whatever credential you use, is compromised, you potentially have access to a wide range of systems using that particular username and password. So that's the other side of the equation. There's also one other benefit, and that's from the security perspective. Yes, it is true that the impact of a credential breach is going to be greater, but it also, by having a single sign-on system, gives us a single place to monitor the infrastructure and to control the accounts that are being used. And at the moment, the common belief is that single sign-on infrastructures, the benefits outweigh the disadvantages. However, with implementing single sign-on, we always have to be cognizant of the fact that now a single credential may provide access to a greater range of services, where if we would have individually authenticated services, that wouldn't be the case. However, at the moment, most beliefs are that single sign-on are a good thing. So the next question, of course, becomes, how do we do that? How do we implement single sign-on infrastructures in a way that is secure and reliable? One of the most commonly used methods for single sign-on was developed by MIT and later adopted by Microsoft in its Active Directory line of products. It's known as Kerberos.
Kerberos was later also standardized as an Internet RFC, a request for comments, and it goes by RFC 1510. Kerberos is a distributed authentication method, and it was used to develop to securely transfer authentication credentials. That's not entirely true, because Kerberos does not really transfer credentials, but it has a mechanism to confirm that people are credentialed. What Kerberos also rolls in is access control. It doesn't just do authentication, it also determines whether or not a subject has access to a resource. We'll talk about access control in a future lesson. For now, it's important to realize that, like many single sign-on infrastructures, Kerberos has been developed as a trusted third party. It is an extra system that sits in the network and whose only purpose really is to authenticate users and to determine whether or not they should have access to resources. The authentication is not performed by the system that you're accessing. Instead, that task, the authentication task, is deferred to a third-party system, and the beauty of Kerberos is that there does need to be a trust relationship between those server systems and the single sign-on infrastructure. There also has to be a trust relationship between the user who wishes to authenticate and the single sign-on infrastructure, but there does not have to be a trust relationship between the user and the service that is being accessed. And that makes scalability of this infrastructure fairly easy. Kerberos, like mentioned, delegates the authentication action to that third party. And that is the Kerberos system. The Kerberos system consists of two main components. The first component is the authentication service. The authentication service knows the credentials of all endpoints, the users, the subjects who wish to authenticate. And it knows them in a way it can use them. In the pure Kerberos implementation, a user's credentials are actually kept in plain text over at the Kerberos system. Modern implementations do better than that, but still the concept is the same. The passwords, again, traditional implementation of Kerberos is password-based, are stored in that authentication service. Secondly, there is a ticket granting service, and the ticket granting service basically provides access to a user after the user has authenticated themselves. Once they have demonstrated that they have made the request to the Kerberos system, Kerberos will use the ticket granting services credentials to send over a request that the endpoint is supposed to basically just forward over. And that means that even though there is a trust relationship between the authentication service and the ticket granting service, the client itself really doesn't know anything. It's basically a conduit. But the beauty is that whatever the authentication service sends back to the client is encrypted with that client's password. Now, if someone else pretended to be that client, they would not know that client's password, and they would not be able to decrypt the payload that was being sent to them. And this concept, where Kerberos is going to send you a payload that is encrypted against a shared secret between whoever receives the encrypted content and Kerberos in order to decrypt it and then forward it on, that keeps on coming back. In CSC280, the computer and network security class that follows this class, we'll go in a lot more detail about Kerberos, and we'll also figure out how we can attack some implementations of Kerberos. For now, all we need to know is Kerberos is one of those mechanisms that we can use to do single sign-on, where there is one authentication service, which means credentials are stored and managed in one location, and that the trust relationship between the endpoints and the single sign-on system, as well as between the single sign-on system and the services, has to exist. But once that is in place, Kerberos will take care of authentication and the mechanism by which a client convinces a service that it is who they claim to be and that they have the appropriate rights to access a service is secure. Kerberos takes care of that. Kerberos as an architecture has never been beaten. There are problems sometimes with implementations, but implementations are relatively easy to fix. The basic architecture and the protocols themselves are robust. And as a result, we can use them to authenticate users. Other systems, other single sign-on systems exist. It's not all Kerberos. But the basic principle is often the same. There is a third-party service. The third-party service takes care of the actual authentication. Sometimes they're referred to as the service provider. And then that authentication action, or rather evidence of the fact that a successful authentication has been conducted, can be presented to services who can then identify the user and determine whether or not they will let them in. Active Directory, Microsoft's implementation, works like that. Shibboleth, which is a web-based system primarily used in higher education, works like that. It's based on the SAML2, the Security Assertion Markup Language. OAuth, which is not really an authentication system, but more a protocol that you can use to transfer authentication states securely, works like that. And there are many different implementations, but between the web-based single sign-on of SAML and OAuth, and between a physical networking infrastructure situation like Kerberos, those are the two most common ones. The idea is the trusted third party, which manages authentication, and the secure channel that exists between the single sign-on infrastructure and the persons who use the service.